There's the live red button. Excellent. Good afternoon. It is Tuesday, January 13th, 2026, here in the House Transportation Committee. Today, we are joined by Costa Pappas from the Agency of Transportation, Federal Policy Director. We're going to hear about federal highway money, grants, sort of the current, what's in lieu, what's we're going for, what's the future look like, and any and all other questions that the committee has. I know that he has a presentation that is, I'm sure, on the committee page. If it isn't, it will be shortly. And I would say, do we need a minute of administrative? Because I have some announcements I could do if we need to, but otherwise, we're good to go on. I'll hit the administrative announcements for our next break. So if you're all set, Costa, thank you much, and it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This is a update on federal policy, specifically dealing with the reauthorization. I do this periodically to let the committee know what's going on in Washington. Sometimes we know more than other times, and of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm going to frame some issues for the committee to consider as we go through this federal 5-year reauthorization process. So I'm glad to be here. A lot of familiar faces and some new faces. Federal transportation policy is critical to the state transportation program. I think you had a joint hearing with House Ways and Means where Logan talked about how 52% or so of the transportation budget is derived from federal sources. That varies from year to year depending on the grants that we receive. And unfortunately, depending on a disaster, that number can inch up even higher. And I say unfortunately, because disaster funding is not the type of federal funding we want coming here. We'd rather avoid the disasters and not have those federal funds. So it's a huge part of the transportation program. And it also generally comes up every 5 years for the surface mode. So this committee deals with the transportation program on an annual basis. Your counterparts in the Senate do the same. In Congress, it's generally every 5 years. So every 5 years, we carefully monitor what's happening in Washington, given how dependent we are on these federal funds and what we can do with them. So this is just kind of an overview of how our different modes of transportation are funded. The highway and transit modes tend to be formula funds that, kind of dedicated federal funding that are recurring and come to us every year. The aviation and rail programs are mostly dependent on discretionary grants where we have to apply and compete with other states to get that funding. And the federal share really ranges. It can go anywhere from 50% for certain types of transit operations, all the way to 90+% for an interstate project, and for safety projects, go even higher. So for capital projects, the vast majority of the funding for state bridges and highways and public transit, railways and airports, the vast majority of it comes from federal funding sources. And here's a simple illustrative chart that shows you how we go from one end of the spectrum, which is dedicated annual formula funding, to the other end, we're completely dependent on competitive grants to undertake capital projects. You see that in aviation. We get a little over $1 million for basic airport operations. But for capital projects, we're totally dependent on the federal government. Rail functions the same way. No grants, no work other than the state appropriation that occurs every year. So these are very important considerations for us as Congress works on the next 5-year bill, because we're so dependent on these different funding sources.
Just a quick question. Can you speak to these that we're dependent on the grant portion of aviation and rail? What percentage, sort of like ballpark, what percentage of applications get denied? So it's dependent on it, but is that routine that we don't get when we ask?
So we've done very well. We're batting about 500. the odds of getting these grants for the most part, I compare it to getting admitted to an Ivy League school. It's 7, 8%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are extremely competitive. And that's, one of the issues is when we're so dependent on this funding and we're only supposed to hit 8 out of every 100 times, it can be problematic. We've done well with grants. We're really aggressive when it comes to pursuing them. I'll give you an example, Representative, the Vermont Railway between Rutland and Hoosick. You're
Familiar with that?
yeah.
Interesting choice of,
So, 3 grants for that one. There was a $20 million build grant. Then there was a $13 million build grant and a $10 million build grant since 2018. So that's 3 in 7 years. The Winooski River Bridge, the 2 major grants, one for about 24, 25 million, the other one for about 20. The Reedsboro Bridge in southern Vermont got 25 million. So the grants come in, and we've been fortunate to have a pretty decent batting average. But that's one of the issues I'm going to talk about is what happens when the IIJA expires? Are these grant programs going to stick around, given that they were, for the most part, one-time general fund dollars? That's a big concern that we have heading into this reauthorization.
Thanks, I just wanted that context of sort of.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We have more bridges, we have to replace the track on there's a lot of projects that are dependent on grants, and it keeps me up at night knowing that September 30th of this year, the IIJA expires and we don't know what's gonna happen next.
Representative Couch?
So what we're saying is, the grant money that we've been spending, trying to get the train to go to Bennington, that was just one-time money in the IIJA, and that there's not like a ongoing formula of how much money is available for grants.
For the most part, correct. So the program that Representative Corcoran was referring to, that was around before the IIJA, but it was funded at 300 million a year, not $2 billion a year. So that's an example of one that was around pre-IIJA. The build grants, also referred to as RAISE and Tiger over the years, they keep changing the names. Those were around before, but 20 of the 26 were introduced as part of the IIJA. And when Congress allocates general funds to them, there's no, kind of technical expectation that they're going to be around afterwards. They can reauthorize them or reappropriate these programs. But remember that the IIJA was signed during an era where unemployment was double digits. There was a lot of concern in Washington as the economy was struggling under the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of funding was injected to it to provide what's effectively a stimulus type activity. Well, the pandemic is no longer with us. Are they going to continue that? And we don't know. And that can have a dramatic effect on the overall program because we'll rely on these dollars and use the state appropriation to, kind of maximize those federal funds for all the modes. Think of the public transit vehicles we purchased over the past few years, the electric, the hybrid, whatever type of transit vehicle, that was a massive injection of funding from Congress into these programs. And we don't know if they're going to be around in 7 or 8 months.
And one more just sort of follow-up. Is it fair to say now, you're telling us, hey, Vermont really relies on these, and we were very fortunate to get the amount we got, and we're really concerned. Is it fair to say all other 49 states would say the same thing? Or are there some states saying, hey, we're getting ripped off, you're giving too much money to Vermont? Or
Yeah, Representative, I can't speak for other states, but if you look around us, the amount of grant funding that's gone to states, the Cape Cod bridges, that's a lot of money. I can't speak on their behalf, but that's a multi-billion-dollar project, and I think they were close to $1 billion in grant funding.
thanks.
All right, so
I think that's
So every 5 years, the transportation bill comes up. I mentioned that September of this year, the current one expires. The federal funding comes to us for highways and transit via the Highway Trust Fund for the most part. But also, general funds have been a staple of the funding that comes to states for probably 20 years now. At one point, the Highway Trust Fund, the outlays kind of equaled the revenue that was coming in. That hasn't been the case in a very long time. There's always been general funds for the past 2 decades transferred into that to kind of keep the Highway Trust Fund afloat. The federal gas tax hasn't increased since 1993. It's remained what it is. And the funding that comes to us in different buckets, right? So it's not, here's a block grant for your whole transportation program. The list that you see is the buckets that they show up in. These are the dedicated formula funds that we've been getting every year from the IIJA. And some of these have been around for a very long time, like the top 2 on the list that pay for interstate highways and bridges. The second one that pays for state highways, town bridges, recreational trails, transportation alternatives, just a variety of different programs. The bottom 2 were brand new, introduced during the IIJ. So the carbon reduction program and the Protect Resilience program were all creations of the IIJA. And that's another question that I'll address in a little while about whether some of these programs are going to continue.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and answer for you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
We don't know. We really don't know. How much does Congress, value some of these programs, and do they want to keep them? And that obviously is going to butt against the fiscal realities of, the last bill was very dependent on the general fund. So there's kind of 2 questions here for Congress to answer. Are you going to continue some of these programs, yes or no? And number 2, where's the funding going to come from?
So prior to the IIJA money, didn't we have another grant that was similar to that?
Which one?
IIJA money, wasn't there a prior grant that kind of did the same thing?
Oh, the formula funds.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
the
So-
FAST Act.
Okay,
The difference, and you can see it in the table here, is that the IIJA injected a lot more money than historically these other transportation bills. So just the four formula funds, we got a 35% increase over the last 5-year bill. And then if you add the general fund supplemental funds that we got for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, that's the NEVI program, and a general fund bridge program, $225 million. That program alone is the equivalent, or was the equivalent of 1 year of all the federal transportation funds that we got. It's a huge amount. It averages an extra $45 million a year over 5 years. Over about 30% of that went to local bridges. Remember the funding that had the construction component being 100% federal, that's this pot of money. So the issue here is more than a philosophical policy on whether we should include certain programs or not, right? Like the climate ones we were just talking about. These are bridges, and they came out of the general fund. So that there's no one's going to argue over the merits of bridges in Washington, but they may argue over, is the general fund the suitable vehicle to pay for this? And that's one of my concerns, is that it's more than just a policy discussion on what should get funded and what should not. There's some serious general fund money in here for bridges that we're not sure will continue. And if it doesn't continue, then we're going to have some serious discussions on how we maintain certain programs, because this allows funding to go to other priorities too, roadway reconstruction, and a bunch of other things. Okay, so the uncertainty I've already discussed. I've also talked about how 20 of the 26 grant programs were introduced during the IIJA, and the economic kind of stimulus component to that bill by adding all this funding. So what typically, again, there's no crystal ball here, but what happens when there's a massive injection of federal funding that's supposed to be one time? There's two examples that we can pull from to see historically what happens. The first was back in 2008, 2009. The financial crisis, again, concerns over unemployment and the economy really taking a downward spiral. Vermont received about $300 million in what at the time was referred to as ERA funding. That was the, I can't read it's covering here, but that was one-time money that we were supposed to use to stimulate the economy. We did. All those dollars were programmed and they were expended. And what happened afterwards? Congress did not keep them going, right? So they disappeared. The second example is the FAA reauthorization bill. Aviation is authorized separately from public transit, highways, and rail. Those are surface modes. The aviation has its own reauthorization bill. In 2024, it was reauthorized. So we're talking calendar year 2023. And what they did for the program that matters to us, the core program that we use to improve airports, is that they increased funding by about 20% in year one. Then they kept it level for 4 more years, and they eliminated all the IIJA supplementals that were added to the aviation program. So what that means in practical terms is we're level. The IIJ comes along, we spike double the previous budgets. And then the IIJ expires in 2026, and we go back down because they chose not to extend. So to your question, representative of, what's the certainty or how do we know? We will never know until we see a piece of legislation and the funding amounts that are associated with it. But historically, what's happened, this is one example of where the stimulus lasts for a little while, then you go back down. So I get asked this question a lot. What's going to happen with federal funding in the future? And I can never answer it fully. But what I tell folks is that formula funds historically inch upward. We haven't seen really a transportation bill that formula funds decline. They always inch up. The problem is when your baseline for the past 5 years has been this amount, and you go down, you can imagine how our batting average, may not survive. If this happens in the highway and public transit world, there's going to be less dollars. It's going to be more competition, and I think it's not unreasonable to think that maybe we're going to get less grant funding coming. So this is just a summary slide that discusses everything I just mentioned a few minutes ago about, what keeps us up at night. It's these things. It's, what happens with this massive bridge program that we've used very successfully over the past 4 years and will continue for the next year. What happens to, some of these policy initiatives that the administration may not agree with? Carbon reduction, resilience, that's a big unknown. And finally, the 20 grant programs, not just their number, but also the amount of funding that was attached to them is pretty big. So that's what we're watching out for. This is what we're concerned about on the federal level, given its potential kind of, fiscal impact or financial impact on our overall transportation program.
So have you heard any discussion, maybe I somewhat covered it, but there was discussions about obviously changing the Congress, changing. Small state minimums have been a huge boom to our state and many others for quite some time, but I have heard some discussion, perhaps today, it's not a Republican Democrat issue, but a big state, small state, takers. Have you heard any movement at all about whether there's any effort you think in this the reauthorization bill that they will make changes to or do away with small state minimums?
Yeah, it's always been a topic of discussion, always going back to Safety Lou 20 years ago. I haven't heard anything this year. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is aiming to have a bill drafted sometime this spring. And if that's the case, they're going to be holding a lot of hearings before they draft their bills. And that's the point at which I think we would hear more about this concept if it were to become an issue. But it's definitely not a new thing. In fact, before the IIJ was signed into law, the House and the Senate had their own versions of a reauthorization bill. The House bill included language to study a recalculation and a recalibration of the federal formula fund method. It didn't change anything, but it required a legislative study. So it's not a new phenomenon. We keep hearing about it periodically, and we have for the past 2 decades. Late winter, early spring, if that becomes an issue, we're definitely going to hear it in the House T&I committee. At least for the House. The Senate's a little behind with their bill, and the House will likely come out with their bill first.
That was relatively new, though. I mean, the concept, maybe the discussion, I thought the implementation of it was relatively new with Senator Lee. I thought that only took effect in the last reauthorization.
No, the small state minimum, and I don't know that, I think that's the term we use for it in Vermont. I don't know that that's an actual term outside the state,
Yeah.
but it actually dates back to Safety Lou. So we're going back 2 decades. And the actual method to do that was that every program that I showed on the list, and I'll pull them up just for your, so all of these programs, the upper part of this table, were carved out using different methods like mileage and population, typical criteria you would use. But they included a provision that no state shall get less than, fill in the blank as it differs by program. And that's how you got to the small state minimum.
Yeah, I didn't realize it went back that far, because I thought so was it true that he sort of got this? I know, I always thought that he just sort of.
Yeah, I don't know.
Got this, a small state minimum, if you want to call it that. But apparently, maybe not.
Yeah, I don't know that it was a specific senator. I mean, the Senate, there's.
Yeah, that's what I always thought he was credited with that. Maybe I'm mixing it up with something. Yeah.
Even the grants that we got.
So this issue, you can go back to the 1960s when the Eisenhower interstate era began. The federal government was funding highways based on where the need to build interstates was at any given time. So there was always an element of, they collected fuel taxes, but the way they allocated them was based on needs to build the interstate system. And that just continued. Then in the 80s, you had to maintain it, and then you had the state highways that became important and the national highway system. So it was never designed from the start to be some sort of, here's what you contribute, here's what you give back. There's federal lands, there's trails. Some states have them, some states don't. So it dates back to the 60s, but during Safety Lou about 20 years ago, that's when these, no state shall receive less than came into existence. And I think it was probably a combination of different Senate delegations, given that they're, senators for the most part represent rural areas. There's very few urban only states. So I don't know who specifically, but it definitely.
Yeah, no, it just takes away from what I thought was sort of fact.
Representative McCoy?
I think our senators and congressperson at the time actually were instrumental in using that for COVID. That's where we got the minimum amount, which is a lot of money.
Yes.
Twice, not once, but twice.
Yeah, and you'll find them across different federal programs. I don't think it's exclusive to transportation or to disaster situations. I think they're pretty common across different federal programs.
Representative Pouch and then Representative White.
Yes, thanks for doing this. So we expect sometime in September here, but have they not been late to to the party, and
Yes.
then would we typically just continue to get the formula funds the way they are now?
Yeah, so every piece of legislation during my career, every 5-year bill, and I'm going back over 25 years, has not gone according to schedule. I don't remember one actually corresponding with its expiration date. So what happens in that case is that there's a twofold process within the transportation committees, there's an extension, they call it a contract extension, which simply means take the IIJ and move it out another year or so. And then the appropriators have to do a continuing resolution to go along with it. That's been the norm, but in this case, I think in the House, the chair of that committee, the rules governing how that party awards chairmanships, is that you can only do 2 terms. He persuaded his caucus to allow a waiver of that because he's adamant that we need to have a transportation bill in place on time. So, take that history and, take the motivation of particular members of Congress, and I'm not sure where we're going to end up, but it's entirely possible we can have a bill in September if the House has one ready to go by spring.
Representative White?
So, can you just clarify for me, so the formula funds, are those is that, because like, I'm looking at highways, 80 to 90% federal funds plus formula funds, so what's the difference between formula funds and federal funds?
Grant funds, yeah. So the difference is the formula funds are in this 5-year bill. They allocate funding every year for the 5 years. So it's a predictable funding stream. We know that.
Like a reliable funding stream coming from the federal government that we can use for transportation projects separate from grant funding.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. So every year we get an allotment, and we know that allotment 5 years. I mean, the appropriators can always say, no, we don't, there's too much money, we're cutting it back. But those funding amounts in that 5-year bill are pretty reliable.
And those are the ones that are typically about our whole transportation budget.
Everything combined is over half,
So the formula funds plus the grant.
plus the grants, yeah, and the disaster funding when those dollars come in too. Right, the grant funds, you have uncertainty, right? So if there was a rail service that needed to be established and you had formula funds, you can do it much quicker than applying for grants, because we have to get the grants, we have to meet all these requirements. You got to do it in smaller chunks because you're not assured that you're going to have future funding. The formula funds make it much easier. You can plan out 5 years knowing that you're going to have federal funds for transit vehicles and highway bridges and whatever it is the project is. Where with grants, it's much more complicated, right? You got to do them in smaller chunks.
And when we are applying for the grants, it sounds like it's, as you said, it's very competitive. Is there a bit of a political system in terms of here are Vermont's applications, sending them down to Washington? Do we have a Vermont representative down there who's like shepherding them through the transportation committee down there? How does that work?
Well, the grants, the decision-making on grants lies with the office of the secretary. So these are executive decision-making that's occurring with these grants. Typically, what happens is we apply for a grant. It goes to whatever the federal modal administration is. So if it's a rail one, it'll go to the Federal Railroad Administration. If we want transit vehicles, it's the Transit Administration. They evaluate them, and then they send the list up to the office of the secretary. And that's where decisions are made on grants. That's how it is. I mean, in a nutshell, that's how the process works. Who gets involved and what they do, I don't know.
Okay. I just didn't know, just as we have advocates here in the building kind of working to push their agendas forward, does the state of Vermont have advocates down in Washington working to make sure our grant applications are getting
Considered.
reviewed in a timely manner and answering any questions and so forth?
Yeah, I can't speak for our congressional delegations, but I presume that there's a lot of that activity going on.
President Powell?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah. Like, there's criteria for these grants. So is there a sort of a check there that says, hey, this grant doesn't meet the criteria. This one does, so therefore, it should be awarded. Accordingly. I mean, is there some kind of check and balance? Can you take them to court if you don't get the grant and you think you deserve it?
I mean, I guess anybody can sue for whatever reason, whether it's successful or not. I mean, going back to my analogy about Ivy League colleges, so you have 100 applicants and 80 of them are straight A students with the highest SAT scores you can imagine. And you can only admit 15. What do you do in that situation? I think these grants are, by virtue of their popularity, how many applications, we're talking hundreds of applications. How do you decide who to admit? Kind of the same idea here with these grants. And we don't know. We don't know what goes into the black box of decision making for these opportunities, but that's the level of competitiveness that we're talking about. Some are 8%, 10%. They're hyper competitive. But they're also critical, and that's always a concern is, are they going to be around? Because we have a lot of bridges that we can use this funding for. We have a lot of transit vehicles that need to be replaced. Airports need a lot of, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Rail, it's never ending in the infrastructure world. And our hope is that these grant programs do not go away, given how important they are to our transportation program.
So on this particular slide, wouldn't our, or maybe doesn't, our own transportation program that's in the Vermont State Transportation would have a similar type of line? In other words, formula funds, town highways, or whatever, they get X amount of money every year, no matter what, or whatever they get it. Then there's over here on the right, you could have the downtown grants or the bike ped grants or the other, the stuff that, and there's other bridge and programs that they can apply to. Would we have a similar sort of chart that says these ones are formula funded and this stuff is grants? You'd have a similar chart. You could potentially have a similar chart on our own state transportation budget, I guess.
It would not look like this one because the decision for grants are not mode specific, right? So within this one, there's a very clear line. If it's an airport, it's got to get a grant. If it's a rail, it's got to get a grant. Our state equivalent chart would be kind of messy because you've got this highway funding, right? And then we have to work within certain parameters. Some of the funding has to be competitively bid out to municipalities, right? So think of all the bike ped, the enhancements, and then even within those, right, some of it has to go to mitigation, some of it has to prioritize bike and ped projects. So it would look very different.
We wouldn't have rail or aviation, towns don't apply for those, but in your highways, in your transit, in your piece, we still have the difference between formula funds and grants on a regular.
Yes.
And we have a scorecard out there that some might argue is whatever that percentage was that you suggested in the amount that were approved. We have towns that feel that they're not going to get based on how many they're going to get, but it does work the same way in terms of certain programs are formula funded and certain pieces are competitive grants.
That's right.
It just happens to be that rail and aviation are state only. They're separate from that.
Yeah, that's an accurate assessment. And one thing I didn't mention about the discretionary grants is, the municipalities have gotten a lot of these grants too. They're not all coming to my mind right now, but Killington, Burlington, South Burlington, St. Albans, a lot of build grants, which were could have been raised grants or target grants at the time, were awarded to municipalities. So these are not exclusively state DOT programs. A local government's can apply for them. Addison County, they got one for a transit facility, right? So they go all over the place and they're not limited to states. Local governments can also, and that's another thing is that, if these programs go away, the grant programs, there's obviously a huge disadvantage to the state because we apply for them frequently. But that's also true of local governments that have their own priorities about enhancing their roadways and the examples I just mentioned, Killington, South Burlington, I think you're talking 60 million plus St. Albans, you keep adding the transit operation in Addison County. It's a lot for local governments too. These are not by any means impacting only the state if they go away.
We have earmarks and federally directed spending, I guess, as another column beyond dedicated formula funds and competitive grants.
Well, those don't fall into either category, so there hasn't been earmarks in close to 2 years, right? There was no appropriations bill last year. So there's no appropriation bill, there's no earmarks. And earmarks kind of come and go. And the priorities of Congress keep changing on them too. 1 year they'll allocate $1 billion nationwide for earmarks. The next year that may go down to a couple of $100 million. So those are, very inconsistent. Once the grants are authorized and appropriated, they're very consistent. They're very competitive, but it's consistent. We know that every year there will be grants for everything I just mentioned, whether it's a local project or a state project. With earmarks, you don't know. And you also don't know the scope of it either. Can you get a $10 million earmark? It's possible. Burlington did it. Have we seen one in the past 5 years anywhere near that dollar amount? No. So that one would go into the bucket of what I call extreme volatility, because we don't know from 1 year to the next, and we also don't know the parameters. And those are not controlled necessarily by our own delegation. They're put in as earmark requests to the appropriations committee of each chamber. So there's another level of decision making that occurs even above our congressional delegation.
Last year at this time, there was a lot of discussion about the funding that happened. We have these, like the NEVI program, the funding's off, now it's back on. Has that sort of smoothed out at this point? I mean, the Winooski Bridge is a big one, and they've got the grants, but should we can count on it?
On the funding arriving?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's grant agreements in place for that. It's always possible that an administration can send a rescission bill to Congress. I mean, these are all, kind of formal mechanisms if they want to. They can send a bill that says we're rescinding everything. And if Congress approves it, it's the law of the land. Is it likely? Probably not. When you sign a grant agreement or you're obligating funding, that's an IOU. That's a promissory note to pay in the future.
But wasn't the NEVI program like that, and they changed the criteria in the middle of it?
Well, they changed the funding parameters, but they didn't withhold the money, right? I mean, permanently, we obligated those funds. But whenever you have a transition from one administration to the next, usually it's more clean in terms of, your funding situation. It's rare that you have a transition like that when you have the IIJA and 20 new grant programs. So this was kind of uncharted territory. And administrations always reserve the right to change their policy orientation. And when the next administration comes in, they may do the same thing. But to legally prevent funding from flowing to a state or a municipality or a nonprofit, wherever the money's destined for, there has to be a congressional act to do that. And you saw that with you may remember, we were awarded, I think it was about 14 million for what was referred to as the Low Carbon Transportation Materials Grant Program. Right, the idea there was to enhance the bridges and the roadway work we do with climate-friendly materials, reducing the carbon footprint. That was included in the rescission bill. They call it budget reconciliation. It was sent to Washington. Congress approved it, so that money disappeared. But nobody had obligated any of that funding. It wasn't at the obligation stage left.
Thank you.
think any other questions? I guess we're at the end of your spot and your time. I thank you very much for coming in. I've got a couple of announcements before we break on. Allison Crowley, on behalf of the Vermont Rail System, delivered our calendars for Vermont Rail System. If you want one, please take it and pass it along. They're pretty cool, and I got a spot that was empty that needs to be filled. You'll see the agenda is out. Tomorrow is very much a public safety, highway safety, crash data. We're going to hear from Vermont State Police. We're going to hear from the DMV. We're going to hear from the agency. It's sort of an entire day of testimony directed sort of at the speaker's request related to highway safety. Then we have public transit. There's been a change in Washington County, Franklin County. There's also issues in terms of what the future of the Green Mountain Transit and update. They've had changes in their structures and pieces and routes. So that day is coming up. Next Tuesday, we won't meet as a committee, but we'll have the governor's budget address. And then we will do a normal, secretary will come in and deliver the budget higher level. And then every department head will come in thereafter and present their section. And then we will start digging into it. The T-bill piece won't come for at least a week or more after the budget address. We won't get into the actual language on the T-bill until after we're already digging into the budget. We won't get our hands on that. The white book is not coming on the day of the budget delivery. We're not going to see the white book for at least a week. They're having some printing problems and some finishing issues. So the white book won't be with our normal budget delivery. Usually we come back from the budget address and they're sitting on our desks. They're not going to be there. So the white book is delayed this year, so we won't see that for a little bit. Yes, Representative Burke.
Speaking of my book, I have the binders from last year. Did they want them back?
I suspect they would be happy to get them back. We'll
So,
even mention them to Michelle when she comes through.
Okay.
Or
I'll
I've
bring
got
it
Rail
out,
mention
bring it out
it.
here. Yeah.
The Black Book is the next piece. Right now, there isn't one. And they're saying that under some new changes that will be online and they will show us where to go find that information, et cetera. We're going to do a little digging into that, but that was a bit of a surprise to learn today. So
I didn't like that news.
we're going to dig into that a little bit. The Black Book is potentially an online thing for us to dig through, but we shall see. So I just wanted to be, thank you, Costa. This will not be, this is a couple of unusual things, and I thought the committee should be aware of that, but we're not getting a hold of the white book as soon, and there is currently not a plan for a black book, but they're somewhere online. And you did get on the good side of the news, my favorite calendar. That was the only positive, that was not the only positive news, but that is,
Where are the old ones that were out there?
I think they took them for the binders to build the new ones.
Signs are here.
I have, but I can still find one I have on it.
They want.
I mean, it's supposed to be